Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky is one of my favorite books of all time, and in this series of videos, I want to try to capture a piece of why that is. The main character of this book is a young man named Raskolnikov, and he's a student. And in the beginning of the book, he's going through all sorts of inner turmoil related to his deep poverty, the discomfort of his sort of miserable condition as an unemployed student living in Petersburg, really a sense of low self-worth, someone who feels that they're dislocated or marginalized by society. And he's debating in his mind, should he steal from the pawnbroker? Should he murder this pawnbroker woman who he feels is worthless, good for nothing, miserly, despised, and take some money to get a start in life? Eventually, he decides to do it, and Raskolnikov's final act of the book is to finally confess that he committed the crime, to walk up to the police station and confess his guilt. And so the two central questions, which I'm interested in focusing on, that I want to sort of use as the focus of this exploration of crime and punishment, is why did Raskolnikov commit the crime? What was behind it? What motivated the crime, as question number one? And question number two is, why did he confess? And I think the answer to these questions are fascinating, surprising, and riveting, and are central to what makes this book so unique. And so we're going to focus on 5 key scenes. I plan to do one video for each of these 5 key pivotal scenes in which this story unfolds, in which these questions begin to get answered. And the first of these 5 scenes is Raskolnikov's first meeting with the detective Porfiry. So in the immediate aftermath of killing this pawnbroker woman and her half-sister Lizaveta, the trauma and the horror of this murder, the fear of almost getting caught in the apartment by 2 painters in the hallway, leaves Raskolnikov in a very deranged state of mind. He's a mess. He's dealing with emotional turmoil. He's in a state of delirium. And as he starts to come out of this, as he starts to recover, it slowly occurs to him. Days have gone by, but it starts to occur to him that he needs to go to the police and tell them that he has pawned some of his goods with this pawnbroker. Her name is Alyona Ivanovna. He has pawned some of his things, and by going to the police and making this police report, he would certainly present as a non-suspicious. That would be a non-suspicious way to present himself. And Raskolnikov has a friend. His friend is Razumikhin. And Razumikhin is in a similar social situation, also unemployed, student, poor, at the lowest strata of society in Petersburg. But Razumikhin is a really deeply kind person who cares so much and is so good to Raskolnikov. They conclude together that, of course, it is necessary for Raskolnikov to go to the police officer. Of course, Razumikhin has no idea of Raskolnikov's guilt. He doesn't suspect anything. He only sees the best in Raskolnikov. But together they decide to go to the police station and to make a report. And that is how we come to part 3, chapter 5. And they show up at the police station, and it's the scene of 2 young men being jolly and sort of malicious to each other, because Raskolnikov is making fun of Razumikhin for being having a crush on his sister, and he's calling him a Romeo, and Razumikhin is furious. Razumikhin is embarrassed, and he's angry, and he says, not a word or I'll beat you to a pulp. And it's in this state that they walk into the police station, and we meet for the first time Porfiry. And Porfiry is this sort of heavy-set, jolly detective who has just charismatic demeanor to him, ingratiating and kind, and always there to shake your hand and pat you on the shoulder, and he's ready to have a laugh with you. And he's, says, like, boys, what's going on? Welcome. What is so funny in this state of sort of wild behavior? A glass gets knocked over, and it leads to sort of some comedic interaction here. Porfiry says, "Why go breaking chairs, gentlemen? It's a loss to the exchequer. I don't know what the exchequer is, but I know from other translations, it's a loss to the government, right? This is saying I have a government job and you're breaking stuff in my office. You're costing the government money. Eventually, the scene calms down. The hands are shaken. And we get from Razumikhin, enough fools all, to business now. This is my friend, Rodin Romanich Raskolnikov. First of all, he's heard about you, and he has been wanting to make your acquaintance. And second of all, he has a little business with you. So now Porfiry's response. As soon as he heard that his guest had a little business with him, he at once asked him to sit down on the sofa, sat down himself at the other end, and stared at his guest, expecting an immediate account of the business, with the sort of eager and all too serious attention that first becomes burdensome and embarrassing, especially for a stranger, and especially when what is being recounted seems, in one's own opinion, out of all proportion to the unusually weighty attention accorded to it. But Raskolnikov explained his business clearly and precisely, in brief and coherent terms, and was left so pleased with himself that he even managed to give Porfiry a thorough looking over. Porfiry Petrovitch, for his part, never once took his eyes off him during the whole time. So now that Porfiry knows that Raskolnikov is coming to make a claim about the items that were left with the pawnbroker woman, Porfiry responds, "You ought to make a statement to the police." Porfiry replied with a most businesslike look, that having been informed of such and such an event, of this murder, that is, you ask, in your turn, to inform the investigator in charge to the case, and that such and such things belong to you, and that you wish to redeem them, or perhaps, however, they'll write it out for you. On ordinary paper, Raskolnikov hastened to interrupt. On the most ordinary, sir. Porfiry Petrovitch suddenly looked at him, somehow with obvious mockery, narrowing his eyes, and as if winking to him. However, perhaps it only seemed so to Raskolnikov, because it lasted no more than an instant. There was something of the sort, at least. Raskolnikov would have sworn to God that he winked at him. The devil knows why. Okay. What emerges in the story is that Porfiry knows a lot more than he lets on. In this early scene, Porfiry plays sort of the ignorant detective who's just meeting Raskolnikov for the first time. But we learn, as we read the book and we follow closely, imagining Porfiry's perspective all along, he has a lot of reason to suspect Raskolnikov. And he's pretty convinced already, even at this early stage, before all the evidence even emerges, that Raskolnikov might be guilty. And so his plan, assuming Raskolnikov is guilty, is going to be to drive Raskolnikov crazy, to let Raskolnikov know, I know what you're up to, and I'm not telling anyone. And to do that, and by doing that, to provoke a kind of reaction, to provoke a misstep, to provoke anger. He's sort of testing Raskolnikov. And we see, by seeing Raskolnikov's internal thoughts and internal monologue, how effective this strategy is of Porfiry. And so we get the first inklings of that already, with this little wink, this subtle wink. And now Raskolnikov is wondering, why did he wink at me? Is he winking at me? What does he know? The story continues. He knows, flashed in him like lightning. The dialogue continues with Raskolnikov explaining why these matters are important to him, even though he's so poor and it's not a lot of money by the pawnbroker. After this back and forth, they make some other small talk about the fact that Raskolnikov's mother recently came to Petersburg to visit him. And then, in a moment of silence, Porfiry sort of interjects. He says, "Your things would not have been lost in any event," he went on calmly and coldly, "because I've been sitting here a long time, waiting for you." And as though nothing were the matter, he solicitously began offering an ashtray to Razumikhin, who was mercilessly flicking cigarette ashes on the carpet. Raskolnikov gave a start, but Porfiry, still solicitous for Razumikhin's cigarettes, seemed not to be looking. "What, waiting? So you knew he had pawned things there?" exclaimed Razumikhin. Porfiry Petrovitch addressed Raskolnikov directly. "Your two things, the ring and the watch. She had wrapped up in one piece of paper with your name clearly written on it in pencil, together with the day and the month when she received them from you." Skipping a bit, he continues, "Yes, almost all the pawners were known now. In fact, you are the only one who has not been so good as to pay us a visit," Porfiry replied, with a barely noticeable shade of mockery. "I was not feeling very well," Raskolnikov says. "So I have heard. I've even heard that you were greatly upset by something. You also seem pale now." And then they go back and forth talking about how Raskolnikov was sick and his delirium, and they all sort of chime in about that. And then they talk about, they should bring some tea because their throats are dry, and they have some small talk about that. And then Porfiry changes the subject. He says that we were all together gathered yesterday at Razumikhin's place, and we were talking about the causes of crime. Where does crime come from? And Porfiry took the stance that crime is rebellion against society. And it's sort of understood in the room that Porfiry doesn't really believe this, that he's sort of just trolling them, But this is a common enlightened socialist idea at the time, that there's no objective right or wrong, no objective good or evil or criminality, but society makes criminals. And when people are criminals, because they're rebelling against a sick society. And Porfiry is taking this argument in this debate. And at this point, Porfiry slyly turns the discussion in the direction of something that Raskolnikov had written in the past. So Raskolnikov asks, "Are you really such a dissembler?" Saying to Porfiry, "Are these really ideas that you pretend to hold?" And he continues, "Did you think I wasn't? Just wait, I'll take you in too. Ha ha ha. No, you see, I'll tell you the whole truth. Speaking of all these questions, crimes, the environment, little girls, I now recall, though it always interested me, a certain article of yours on crime or whatever it was. I don't remember the title. I've forgotten. I had the pleasure of reading it 2 months ago in Periodical Discourse." And at this, Raskolnikov is taken aback. He's shocked. He just learns for the first time that an article of his was published and that Porfiry had read it and take note. It was Raskolnikov's article on crime. "My article in Periodical Discourse?" Raskolnikov asked in surprise. "I did indeed write an article dealing with a certain book 6 months ago when I left the university, but at the time I took it to the Weekly Discourse, not Periodical." Anyway, they go back and forth. So yeah, it got published in the Periodical Discourse. Okay, he learns about this now for the first time. And so now Raskolnikov has to justify what he did. He has to talk about this article he wrote. So he says, "Yeah, as I recall, I was considering the psychological state of the criminal throughout the course of the crime." So Porfiry says, "Yes, sir, and you maintain that the act of carrying out a crime is always accompanied by illness. Very, very original. But as a matter of fact, what interested me was not that part of your article, but a certain thought tossed in at the end, which unfortunately you present only vaguely, by way of a hint. In short, if you recall, a certain hint is presented that there supposedly exists in the world certain persons who can, that is, who not only can, but are fully entitled to commit all sorts of crimes and excesses, and to whom the law supposedly does not apply." Raskolnikov smiled at this forced and deliberate distortion of his idea. "What? How's that? The right to commit crimes? But not because they're victims of the environment?" Razumikhin inquired, even somewhat fearfully. No, not quite because of that," Porfiry replied. "The whole point is that in his article, all people are somehow divided into the ordinary and the extraordinary. The ordinary must live in obedience and have no right to transgress the law, because they are, after all, ordinary, while the extraordinary have the right to commit all sorts of crimes and in various ways to transgress the law, because in point of fact they are extraordinary. And that is how you had it, unless I'm mistaken," Porfiry says. So we see at this point the formulation of Raskolnikov's idea, which is directly parallel and runs very much aligned and synchronous with Nietzsche's concept of the Superman, the Ubermensch. This idea there's a special kind of person in the world. And this is the idea we're going to explore more in this chapter, in this discussion, the Ubermensch, Raskolnikov's Superman. This idea of someone who is above the herd, to whom the law does not apply. The law applies to the herd, to the regular people. They are the law followers, and then there are the law givers. There are people who are more powerful, more capable, more beyond, and the laws just don't apply to them. This is pure Nietzsche, a purely beautiful Nietzschean idea. And this is, of course, not the only place, not the first place, not the only place where a character in a Dostoevsky book is sounding a lot like Nietzsche. The other famous example would be Ivan from the Brothers Karamazov, who deals not with the Superman but other Nietzschean ideas. As far as we know, Dostoevsky never read any Nietzsche. We think that Nietzsche has read a little bit of Dostoevsky. Nietzsche mentions his respect for Dostoevsky in one of his later books, but as far as we know, the reading didn't go the other way around. So now Raskolnikov starts to clarify his ideas, and these ideas are going to be sort of explored. I do not at all insist that extraordinary people absolutely must and are duty-bound at all times to do all sorts of excesses, as you say. I even think that such an article will never be accepted for publication. I merely suggested that an extraordinary man has the right, that is not an official right, but his own right, to allow his conscience to step over certain obstacles, and then only in the event that the fulfillment of his idea, sometimes perhaps salutary for the whole of mankind, calls for it. You have been pleased to say that my article is unclear. I am prepared to clarify it for you as far as I can. He continues, I recall developing in my article the idea that all the lawgivers and founders of mankind, starting from the most ancient and going on, the Lycurguses, the Solons, the Mohammeds, the Napoleons, and so forth, that all of them, to a man, were criminals, from the fact alone that in giving a new law, they thereby violated the old one, held sacred by society and passed down from their fathers, and they certainly did not stop at shedding blood either. If it happened, that blood could help them. It is even remarkable that most of these benefactors and founders of mankind were especially terrible bloodshedders. In short, I deduce that all, not only great men, but even those who are a tiny bit off the beaten track, that is, who are a tiny bit capable of saying something new, by their very nature cannot fail to be criminals, more or less to be sure. Otherwise, it would be hard for them to get off the beaten track, and of course they cannot consent to stay on it. So, Raskolnikov's point is that to make progress, to be great, to say something new, to be powerful, to be someone who pushes society forward and expands our thinking, you have to be prepared to break the law. You have to be prepared to break idols and destroy aspects of society. Skipping a bit, in subsequent generations, these same masses place the punished ones on a pedestal and worship them. The first category is always master of the present, the second master of the future. The first preserves the world and increases it numerically. The second moves the world and leads it towards a goal. They have more back and forth. They talk about a sense of guilt and punishment, and is there a pang of conscience in these people? And they go back and forth. Porfiry has more questions. He continues, tell me this. How does one manage to distinguish these extraordinary ones from the ordinary? Because you must agree, if there is some sort of mix-up and a person from one category imagines he belongs to the other category and starts removing all obstacles, as you quite happily put it, well then, Raskolnikov, it happens quite often. Raskolnikov says, yeah, you have people from one category getting confused and thinking they belong in the second category, right? Nietzsche is dangerous. A lot of people have commented on this. A lot of people have pointed out and said Nietzsche's philosophy is dangerous because you'll read Nietzsche and you'll think you're a Superman. And Raskolnikov says yes, it's a dangerous philosophy and people will mess up. People will think they're a Superman when they might not be. Raskolnikov responds that it's not a big deal. That's why we have laws. That's why we have police officers and detectives to arrest those people who make the mistake. Porfiry asks, what are the numbers? How many people are we dealing with here? So he talks for a while about this. He says, an enormous mass of people, of material exists in the world, only so that finally, through some effort, some as yet mysterious process, through some interbreeding of stocks and races, with great strain, it may finally bring into the world, let's say, at least one somewhat independent man in 1,000. Perhaps 1 in 10,000 is born with a broader independence. With a still broader independence, 1 in 100,000. Men of genius, 1 in 1,000,000. And great geniuses, the fulfillers of mankind, perhaps after the elapsing of many thousands of millions of people on Earth. This sounds so much like Nietzsche, imagining the Ubermensch who comes once every, who knows how many hundreds of years. Such a rare occurrence that Nietzsche's anticipating. And now Porfiry really starts to press Raskolnikov on this essay, on this paper of his. He says, "Well, sir, curse me if you like, be angry if you like, but I cannot help myself. Allow me one more little question. Now then, sir, it really cannot be that when you were writing your little article, you did not regard yourself, say just the tiniest bit, as one of the extraordinary people, as saying a new word in your sense. Isn't that so, sir?" Right? Certainly, when Nietzsche writes his books about the Superman, we know Nietzsche thinks he's a Superman, right? There's no doubt about that. We know that. So Porfiry says to Raskolnikov, you no doubt think you're one of those people writing an essay like that. "It's quite possible," Raskolnikov replied disdainfully. Razumikhin stirred. "And if so, sir, can it be that you yourself would venture, say in view of certain worldly failures and constraints, or somehow for the furtherance of all mankind, to step over the obstacle? Well, for instance, to kill and rob?" And he somehow suddenly winked at him again, with his left eye, and laughed inaudibly, exactly as earlier. "If I did, I would certainly not tell you," Raskolnikov answered, with defiant, haughty disdain. And now Zametov, who's another detective or police officer, someone who's had conversations with Raskolnikov in the past, who harbors suspicions as well, says, again, pointing the finger clearly at Raskolnikov, "Might it not have been some future Napoleon who bumped off our Alyona Ivanovna with an axe last week?" And Raskolnikov was silent, looking firmly and fixedly at Porfiry. Razumikhin frowned gloomily. He seemed to have begun noticing something even earlier. He looked wrathfully around him. A moment of gloomy silence passed. Raskolnikov turned to leave. Right at this point, Razumikhin realizes that they think it's Raskolnikov who did the murder. "Leaving already?" Porfiry said kindly, holding out his hand with extreme affability. "I'm very, very glad to have made your acquaintance. And concerning your request, do not be in any doubt. Simply write as I told you, or best of all, come to my office yourself one of these days, tomorrow even. I'll be there around 11 o'clock for certain. We can settle everything and talk. Since you were one of the last to be there, you might be able to tell us something," he added, with a most good-natured air. Right as he's about to leave, Porfiry just bothers him with one question. Raskolnikov had told Porfiry that earlier he'd gone up to the pawnbroker's room to deposit the goods at the pawnbroker. And as he's leaving, Porfiry says, "What time was it?" "It was before 8, Raskolnikov answered. So Porfiry says, "Oh, so passing by the stairs before 8 o'clock, did you at least notice 2 workers in the open apartment, remember? On the second floor, or at least one of them? They were painting, didn't you see? This is very important for them." "Painters?" "No, I didn't see, and I didn't notice any open apartment either." Skipping a bit. "But what's the matter with you?" Razumikhin exclaimed suddenly, as if coming to his senses and figuring things out. "The painters were working on the day of the crime itself, and he was there 2 days earlier. Why ask him?" Right? So Razumikhin says, the painters were on the day of the crime. "Pah! I got it all mixed up." Porfiry slapped himself on the forehead. "Devil take it. The mind stumbles all over itself with this case," he said to Raskolnikov as if in apology. "It's so important for us to find out if anyone saw them in the apartment between 7 and 8 that I fancy just now you might be able to tell us. I got it totally mixed up." "Well, so you ought to be more careful," Razumikhin observed morosely. These last words were spoken in the entryway. Porfiry Petrovitch saw them right to the door with extreme affability. They both came out to the street, gloomy and sullen, and did not say a word for a few steps. And when they get on the street, Razumikhin is furious. He says, "How could they do this to you? How could they blame you?" And he says, they have nothing to go on. They have no facts. Their suspicion is is ridiculous. And he then gives a description of why they're suspicious of him. He says, must be why they're blaming you. He says, how dare they? Where are its roots hidden? If you knew how furious I was, just because a poor student, he's talking about Raskolnikov, crippled by poverty and hypochondria, on the verge of a cruel illness and delirium, which may already have begun in him, insecure, vain, conscious of his worth, who for 6 months has sat in his corner seeing no one, in rags, in boots without soles, is standing there in front of some local cops suffering their abuse. And here there's an unexpected debt shoved in his nose. Right? So this is Razumikhin saying they blame you. They blame you because you fainted at one point when there was someone put an IOU, a debt, under your nose and said you owe money to your landlord. And at the time someone started talking about the murder and Raskolnikov fainted. And now Razumikhin is saying that's why they blame you. And the irony of that is in his outrage, in his fury, in his anger about how unfair this is, he articulates sort of what drove Raskolnikov to this. It's one of the most clear, precise formulations of the elements that drove Raskolnikov to his crime. A poor student, crippled by poverty and hypochondria. Insecure, vain, conscious of his worth, who for 6 months has sat in his corner seeing no one, in rags, in boots without soles. And that ultimately, Razumikhin points to as the cause of their suspicion, and we know as the reader is the cause, to some extent, of the crime.